I'm Jens de Gitt, and this is the session on rethinking science communication. I'm organizer of a media platform called Science Stories DK, and I'm also president of the European Union of Science Journalist Associations called OISHA. In this session, we will present results from 3 current Horizon 2020 projects. It's the Concise, the Quest, and the Rethink, which measure and analyze the state-of-the-art of science journalism and communication in Europe, seen from different perspectives. We will discuss what we have learned from science communication in Europe and what is the state-of-the-art and the answers to all the questions on how to fight fake news, stop false rumors, and how we reach our audiences much better on which medium and what kind of stories. I'm really looking forward to this session where we have 3 speakers, each with their angle on how to improve the communication of knowledge. In the end, we have Professor Ulrike Feld to give her analysis of the situation. And we have questions, a lot of questions and debate in the very end. First speaker is Ana Delicado from University of Lisbon, Portugal. Ana will tell us what we can learn from the Concise project. The floor is yours, Ana.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to present some of the results we achieved with the project Concise. I'm representing a much larger team with participants from 5 European countries, but let's talk about that a little further on. The Concise project is funded by the European Commission under the Science with and for Society program in Horizon 2020. It started in December 2018, and it was supposed to end this November, but probably we're going to ask for a small extension because, like many people around the world, our research has been hindered a little bit by the pandemic. This project is coordinated by Carolina Moreno from the University of Valencia, and the consortium has 5 countries, Italy, Poland, Portugal, Slovakia, and Spain. And within these 5 countries, 9 partners. 5 of them are academic, 2 are small or medium enterprises, and 1 is a civil society organization, which is the Spanish Association for the Communication of Science. The objectives of Concise are multifold, but we will focus on this presentation on just 3 of them. The main objective is to increase our understanding of how beliefs, perceptions, and knowledge about science and technology-related issues originate among EU citizens. Also to enable active citizen participation in scientific research, in the scientific research process, and to measure also the positive or negative perception of citizens participating in a public consultation on a selection of stories related to science. So our core methodology was a public consultation held in the 5 countries with 100 citizens in each. This aims mainly to go beyond the results of typical science perception surveys. We really wanted to engage with a dialogue with participants about science communication, how they collect information, how they evaluate the information they receive, what proposals do they have to improve science communication. And we focus on 4 topics: climate change, GMOs, vaccines, and complementary medicine. We divided the participants in smaller tables, of course, and we engaged them in discussion. So we collected a lot of qualitative data, but also at the end of each discussion, we asked them to perform a semi-quantitative activity for each of the topics that were being discussed. The consultations were held at the end of last year, between September and November, We managed to have 497 participants, so we didn't quite reach the target of 500. Most of them were female, which is surprising in a way. And we started in Italy and ended in Portugal with these consultations. I'm going to bring you some of the results we achieved with the content analysis of the transcriptions of the discussions. At the moment, we only have 4 reports completed, so Portugal, Spain, Poland, and Italy. So the data I'm going to show is about just these countries. It's a semi-quantitative analysis of the results, but we also have citations to illustrate the points of view of participants. One of the first issues of discussion for the 4 topics was, where do citizens get their information? So the sources and channels of information. We realize there are significant differences between topics, but there's a tendency to rely mostly on traditional media and digital media to access that information. Also have, in a smaller percentage, communicators of science, citizens among themselves, families, relatives, colleagues from work or school. In a smaller measure, we also have people citing organizations, public and private, as the sources of their information about these topics, scientists. And so, but there's a predominance of media as a source of information about scientific topics. Breaking down what sort of media people are talking about, in terms of legacy media, it's mostly TV by a long distance, followed by newspapers and magazines. On digital media, websites and social networks are by far the main sources that were cited by the participants. We also coded the way people talk about each topic. These are sums. I cannot, of course, there are significant differences between countries and between topics, but just to give you a general idea, we have, in terms of awareness of the scientific topic, in terms of interests and practices of sharing information, but also familiarity, knowledge about the topic, we have this interesting result that a lot of people feel little informed about the scientific topics. Most of them say they are not familiar with it, but they also show a lot of interest and intense practice of sharing information, particularly on social media. We have this example of a citation from one of the participants explaining why he got interested in the topic of complementary and alternative medicine and what he did to find information about it and how he formed his opinion about the topic. In terms of the perception of science communication, in terms of quantity and quality, we found that most people complain about a lack of information about the topics, but some also complain of an overload of information about climate change or vaccines or these topics. In terms of the quality of information, most participants complain about the quality in terms of bad information, misinformation, false news, information that is biased and not balanced, information that is confusing and contradictory. So we had more complaints than people being complimentary or being positive about the quality of science communication. And of course, we also try to assess how they form their trust or their mistrust in sources. And the funny thing is that people tend to trust mostly than they tend to mistrust. There are more expressions of trust in the information they receive and less of mistrust or doubt. We had this example from Poland, where they show there's a lot of trust in government information about vaccines. And also this one about climate change that shows the difference between trust in scientists and less trust in journalists. It's quite common. There's also, of course, always the idea that companies are not reliable sources of information, that they are biased towards their own interests. They have money in consideration rather than information for the public. In terms, we also found that most of the participants are they say they are quite skilled in terms of how they evaluate the information. It's always an issue of the others have problems. For the others, it's confusing, it's misleading, there's an overload and there's no way to. But most of the participants stated that they had their own strategies to verify the information, to check who funded the studies, to make their own evaluation, or asking for help from a doctor or a scientist, and searching for information, contrasting sources. We found a lot of different strategies people use to make sense of a, like one of our participants said, it's like being in the sea without a paddle. There's the amount of information that circulates, particularly in social networks and the internet, is considered difficult to evaluate, but some of our participants do have strategies to deal with it. And finally, in terms of credibility and authority, we have different positions. Experts and scientists, unlike what is said, are still very trusted. Perhaps it's also an effect of the bias of our samples. Of course, we didn't get a lot of people who had less information or with lower education attainment levels. So of course, we had more informed and more engaged participants that would probably be the national average. So there was not a lot of distrust in science. We didn't find it, almost nowhere. There was not a distrust of experts, rather the opposite. There's distrust sometimes of journalists, of companies, but a lot of trust in government officials and governmental bodies and international organizations like the World Health Organization, and not so much on journalists and what is circulated on social media. What I finished presenting now is solely an exploratory approach to the data we collect. We had thousands of pages of transcriptions. We are still improving our analysis, because you have to imagine what it is to work with five different languages, 5 different cultures. And so the way we try to follow a pattern in terms of coding, but now that we are looking at the reports, we see that there are some differences. So we will probably have to recode some fields. We still have to improve our quantitative analysis. And we do have to work more on international comparisons and topic comparisons, and also look at socio-demographic variations. We also still have a lot to do in terms of building a theoretical framework to interpret these results. And we aim very soon to start issuing recommendations for practitioners and policymakers. We are starting to work on policy briefs for each country. And of course, like in all participatory methods, it's crucial to give feedback to participants, and we are also working on attractive ways of communicating our results to the citizens who participated in our consultations, but also the public in general. And that is it.
Thank you very much, Ana Delicado. Can I have a question? I would like to know, because I was myself very surprised that there was an overload of information, that was one of the things you reported about. Were there something which surprised you?
Well, not really. I think we all live in an information society, and we know that there are a plurality of channels and sources, and we're being bombarded with information. But what my interpretation of these results is that some people think it's too much, that even though the majority stated that they felt less informed and had a lack of knowledge and familiarity with the topics, others thought that they were being bombarded with information about climate change, with information about vaccines, but there was a lot of criticism on the quality of this information. For instance, in terms of climate change, I seem to remember, there was a lot of the idea that there should be more practical advice on what citizens can do, and less just dramatic illustrations of climate change and storms and things like that. So there was a significant number of participants who complained about the overload of information.
Thank you very much. That's really some important messages to take home, to understand also when you communicate climate change and other issues. Thank you very much, Ana Delicado. And I would like to introduce the next speaker, which is Arko Olesk from Tallinn University in Estonia. He will tell us about the quality of science communication in the Quest project. The floor is yours, Arko.
Thank you, Jens. Thank you, Anna, for these previous presentations. I'm representing the Quest project, which was funded by the Horizon 2020 from the same call that also Concise and the Rethink project, which we'll hear about afterwards. So Quest, again, stands for Quality and Effectiveness in Science and Technology Communication. So the real focus of our project has been to think about what is quality and how to make science communication more effective. And the starting point for this project has been many of the concerns that we have in our societies about how science is being communicated to the public and how to make it more effective. We know all the major problems also related to vaccines, climate change, etc. So we really wanted to find out in this project what we can do to improve the situation. But to start with, when we think about quality, and we hear a lot that an answer to these problems that were described is that we need more and better quality science communication. And then, of course, the first question is, what is quality in that context, in science communication? So I'm going to introduce here some of the results that we got from the project, especially to this question: what is quality science communication? How can we define it? How can we evaluate it? To address this problem, we turned to stakeholders in science communication, so people who are on the production side of science communication and also consumer side of it, or user side. We invited stakeholders from 5 different partner countries together. So stakeholders like journalists, including science journalists, researchers from all different fields, science communication professionals, and science decision makers, so people working at the universities, but also members of the public who are not on a daily basis working on science or communication. And we invited them together just to ask them, what do they consider quality in science communication? When they got together in those workshops, 6 workshops in 5 countries, we organized them in groups, keeping in mind that every group would be diverse, so that all of the stakeholders are represented there in order to guarantee that all the different viewpoints or perspectives will be on the table. And then we asked them first individually to think about what are the elements of quality of science communication for them, and then work in groups to kind of produce a map of quality. So they had to work together to organize all of the inputs into kind of one map. We call them quality maps, and you see one example on the screen there, where those individual inputs were organized in this group session and kind of related to each other. And as you see, some patterns emerge, and when we collected all of the maps, so 15 maps altogether, and analyzed the individual elements and the patterns, we kind of formulated based on these 12 quality indicators that we consider to be representative, or what we think the stakeholders consider the most important quality elements in science communication. So they are on the screen. I'm not going in depth into all of them. I'm just highlighting that we organize them in 3 major pillars. The first one is related to elements that provide trustworthiness to the communication. So that the sources are science-based, the presentation is objective and factual, and it is balanced and transparent, so that anyone who can look at the communication has enough information to decide whether this is trustworthy. The second pillar is related to presentation and style, so things that make science communication engaging, spellbinding, attractive, clear, understandable, accessible, all these kind of elements. And the third pillar is kind of, we label it connection with the society. So it brings together the elements that show the connection of science communication with the society. So kind of getting input from the society, so the daily concerns of citizens, or relating the communication to the daily lives of people. And also here is that science communication needs to be responsible, so following ethical standards, taking part in those major discussions in the society to address problems, etc., etc. So we identified those 12 indicators, and also based on the analysis of the input that we got from the workshops, also kind of formulated some principles of how this framework can be used in order to evaluate science communication quality. It is important to highlight here that this applies to the content side of science communication. So this framework can be used to evaluate what is produced in science communication, and the next step, the effectiveness of how to let's say citizens respond to this content. This is something that's the next step for next projects. But for these indicators, we would like to emphasize that, or at least as you saw on the map, it's not like some of the indicators are more important than others. No, actually, they all work together, and it is not that some of them are most important, or that you can compensate the missing of some indicators by a very good performance in the other. No, actually, what comes out from these maps is that they all need to be present in order for the science communication to be considered quality. And it also indicates that the quality is not just being accurate or just being engaging, but it needs to be accurate, engaging, relatable, impactful, all of the things at the same time. So it's kind of quality is produced by this multidimensional approach and synergy between the elements. While saying that all indicators are important, of course, we must acknowledge that situations, formats of science communication differ. We cannot evaluate, let's say, for example, a TV debate on climate change similarly to, let's say, a hike in the nature where people learn about species. So those different formats, topics, contexts, objectives influenced somewhat how those indicators can be used to evaluate science communication content. It doesn't mean that some indicators cannot be used in some certain situations. What I'm rather highlighting is that the weight of each indicator can be slightly different in those situations. And foremost, we suggest and hope that this framework can be useful as a guidance and self-assessment tool for science communication professionals to kind of look at what they are doing and think about, am I addressing all of these issues? Are all of these fairly represented? And where are the aspects where I still can improve? Since, I mean, our first ambition was also that we could produce some sort of key performance indicators to evaluate science communication more universally. But as we progressed, we very quickly learned that most of these aspects are not quantifiable in a very objective manner. So we do have guiding questions, but we rather recommend this be used as a self-assessment tool rather than official evaluation tool. And those results within the project will be used for several other tools and outputs within the project, like an artificial intelligence tool for journalists, a curriculum, guidelines, handbooks, and policy recommendations. But we also hope that this kind of framework can provide input for further practical science communication activities beyond this project. For example, it would be really interesting to kind of, relate our results with the results of the other Horizon 2020 projects. So, like I said, maybe evaluate if some kind of content is being considered quality or high quality within this framework. How does the audience receive it? Do they also perceive quality in the same way? I'm really grateful to all the partners we've had in the project. So several of them contributed to this work, organizing workshops, analyzing, adjusting the indicators to specific strands of science communication that we focused on, like journalism, social media, and then museums. And here I would like to conclude, and if you have any questions later on, we'll be happy to discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arku Olesk. That was really, really interesting. I was thinking about these different parameters that you investigated. Is it so that you could actually detect a difference of preference in the different countries that you looked into? For example, were there countries where people were more interested in technical input or emotional input? Could you say something about that?
No, I think our sample is probably too small. So we had maybe 15 to 18 people in each country participating in the workshop. So I think this is not enough to kind of bring out these differences. And I think it is not such significant differences do not exist. So I think the idea what we got there is that it is quite universal in all of the countries. The same elements, the same topics came to the front. So I think this indicates that we can believe that the framework is pretty universal within Europe, within the formats, within the topics.
That sounds really interesting, but I was thinking about another parameter. For example, if the target group is general public or maybe young people, could you see any difference there?
Actually, one of the indicators that we identified is that the communication is targeted to specific groups or is designed to these specific target groups. So in that sense, I think if the target group is different, the indicator of quality is how well the communication is designed towards this specific target group. So I think that kind of covers this aspect without having the need to kind of design different indicators for different target groups.
Thank you very much, Arko Olesk. I will introduce the third speaker, which is Frank Cooper from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Frank will tell us everything about the Rethink program and how science communication should be totally different in the future, or will it? The floor is yours, Frank.
Thank you very much, Jens, and the other speakers for their presentations. My name is Frank Kupper from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and I will talk to you about the Rethink project, which is the third EU-funded project in the same call as Concise and Quest to re-examine science communication in light of that's at least the focus that we chose, in light of the blurring boundaries between science and society and the digital age that we are living in. So the Rethink project started a bit later than the Quest and Concise project. So we are halfway our project. So I will not present you our full results, but give you some highlights and talk to you about our approach. So an important starting point for our project was the observation that we, as societies, increasingly recognize the complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity of our worlds and of science in that world and our relation to science. Now, these characteristics, so the complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity, ask for a different kind of science, actually, to understand it, get to grips with it, and act upon it, as we can see in examples that I've put here. Like climate change or artificial intelligence, and also the COVID-19 pandemic that we are experiencing right now. It does not only ask for a different kind of science, but also for different forms of communication. So just as, at least that was the starting point of our project, just as science as a pursuit of objective truth may not fit this complex and uncertain world that well. Also, science communication as explaining those truths again and again to audiences may not fit what is expected in this world. The Rethink project takes this as a starting point, and we recognize that communication about science technology in society has become increasingly complex and challenging because of two issues. One is the blurring of boundaries between science and society that has been going on for at least decades. So what we see is more and different connections between different actors that are crossing the boundary between science and society over and over. This has broadened the range of actors that are involved in science communication, for example, in collaboration, or co-production, and therefore it has also extended the range of issues that are part of the debate about science. Then the next thing is what we call the digital revolution, which has increased the number of platforms and channels and also the diversity of players that are involved. And more importantly, as Brian Trench has once called it, it has given access to backstage conversations. For example, in the COVID-19 pandemic, you can see now two epidemiologists disagreeing on Twitter about what are the appropriate assumptions of a transmission model. Now, these conversations used to happen at scientific conferences that were closed from the general public. Now they are out there in public, and other people with other backgrounds and perspectives can easily join those discussions or, well, at least have an opinion about them. Now, in our project, we wonder how do these issues change the working practices of scientists and science communication professionals and the ways by which citizens make sense of science. So what we do in our project is that we aim to, first of all, map and understand the landscape that is arising due to these two interrelated changes. Second, we want to develop new and improved ways of communicating science in a digital age. And we do this with a special focus on enhancing the openness of science and science communication to different people and perspectives in society, and also the reflexivity of communication. So our approach is that we start with mapping the science communication ecosystem to see which actors are playing a role in that system, what are their relations, what are their roles, and their repertoires, which is a term for how they think about the relationship between science and society and act upon it. We look then at the practices of citizens in making sense of science and technology. And we look at the quality of interaction. So there are a lot of similarities between our project and the Quest projects, with a focus on openness and reflexivity. And our project is not only a research project, it's also an action project. So we are looking to develop a transformative learning network that we call Rethinker Space. In our project, we have set up 7 Rethinker Spaces in the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, UK, Sweden, Italy, and Serbia. And these Rethinker Spaces are transdisciplinary groups where people with mixed backgrounds, so scientists, science journalists, science communicators, policymakers, artists, amateur science communicators, they get together. They collect data within the project, they reflect on this data, and together they develop and experiment with new ways of doing science communication. So these Rethinker Spaces are an important part of our project. What I will do now is give you a few highlights of results we have found so far. One of the things that our UK partners from University of West England in Bristol did was an online survey among science communicators and journalists. So they got 465 responses from each of the Rethinker Space countries and more. And the survey, for example, asked for the working practices of these science communicators and journalists, for what type of science communication they practice, what channels or platforms they use, but also what their purpose and motivation in science communication is, how they connect to their audiences, etc. If you are interested in a more in-depth view into this survey, there is a blog written, the URL is screened here below, and it will also lead you to the full report. Now, one of the conclusions of this survey was that science communication, at least for our sample of participants, is still more dissemination than dialogue. So the motive, the purpose of the science communicators and journalists was more to inform and educate people than to, for example, start conversations or exchange ideas. Another striking result was that the audiences that people were trying to reach were mostly audiences that are already interested in science. Audiences that are not interested in science, or what we sometimes call underserved audiences or hard to reach audiences, were well, not reached and also not intended to reach, which is, I think, striking, because a lot of people are also talking about the need to actually bridge the gap to those not interested and underserved audiences. Apparently, not a lot of people are doing that yet. Another striking result was that conversations between science communicators and their audiences often do not happen. So the question here is, how well do you know your audience? How well do you understand what they need, and understand how they are looking at the world and the issues that you are trying to communicate? Some underlying reasons that may explain these findings we got when we discussed these issues in the 7 rethinker spaces. Here you see 3 underlying reasons that were mentioned. First of all, a lack of time to engage in these conversations, but also that science communicators and journalists indicate that they find it difficult to have these conversations with people that are different from them, or have a different way of looking at things. A lot of people in these thinking spaces also indicated that they had a sense of disconnect with other groups in society that are at the moment not participating in the conversation. I think this ties well to another study that we have been doing in the project into citizen sense-making practices. Originally, we planned to do this study into climate change communication, but then COVID-19 happened, and we decided that there was nothing else to do than to really step into this and try to make a contribution to how we deal with this pandemic. So we took a sense-making perspective that has been developed by Brenda Derwin and colleagues. The question here is, how do citizens navigate a complex, chaotic, and incomplete reality? As we also saw from the presentation of Ana Delicado, for example, people do get their information from traditional sources like media or institutions, but the way they make sense of that information is also dependent on their social environment, on their past experience, on the people around them. So we decided to focus really on what we call the micro moments. So the moment when people try to make sense of a situation that they do not fully understand yet. So we have done 80 micro moments interviews in 8 countries so far. We are still in the middle of collecting the data, analyzing the data, and developing our results. But I will give you a few highlights. First of all, what I think may be expected is that these practices are highly dynamic and complex, and very dependent on context and a lot of different factors. Also, the temporal dimension is important. These sense-making interviews gave us an idea of how people's individual situation and also their feelings, emotions, and worldview are important in how they form a balanced interpretation of what is going on. Now, understanding these processes, we believe, is key to improving the quality of interactions between science communicators, journalists, and their audiences. As I said in the beginning, in this complex and uncertain world, explaining it again is not the solution anymore. So we really have to understand how these conversations and sense-making processes work in order to tap into it and to make a contribution as science communicators and journalists to improve people's understanding of science and technology. Now, in the future, we are going to develop and experiment with these ideas. So we are closing now the first phase of the project where we were mapping the new landscape. And now we are, for example, developing a new framework for quality of science communication based on a Delphi study with experts and discussions in our Rethinker spaces. Based on these on the survey and on the sense-making research, we are developing strategies to increase openness and reflexivity of science communication. And in the end, we will develop training resources for science communicators and journalists to put all these things together and help to move this community forward. If you want to follow us, this is our website. You can also find the connections to social media there. And I would like to thank our team, all our partners for their amazing work. And I am looking forward to what we are going to bring in the next 1.5 years. Thank you very much. This was my presentation.
Thank you, Frank Cooper. That was really, really interesting. One of the most scary thing you talked about was this this thing that people are in their own little bubbles and they are not possible to reach. To what degree is that happening? That people are completely detached to information about climate change or vaccines or changes in the environment that they should know about.
Sorry, you mean in what degree people are?
Yeah. So to what degree are people living in their own bubbles? Is this a big problem, or is it a problem you see increasing in Europe? Because it is difficult to grasp all this information.
Yeah, so I don't think that it is, I do think it is a big problem, but the problem is, I think, different than we all thought at first when everybody was talking about filter bubbles, etc. So I think the problem is not that you don't see or meet other people or other sources of information. Actually, online you are confronted with difference a lot. But the problem is that actually in how we respond to that difference, and actually we shy or move away from it because we maybe are scared of it or feel uncomfortable by it. So actually, so we try to retrieve in our own community. And what I think was one of the striking findings of in our Rethinking Space discussions is this is not only true for our audiences, this is also true for science communication professionals and journalists. So I think this brings us to an old saying that if you want to change the world, you have to change yourself first.
Oh, that sounds very, very, very interesting. I was also thinking about that it's my perception that many communicators are working at universities where they have a very much a marketing approach on how to communicate research, how good they are, and they are aware of it, but they are employed at a university where the university professors wants them to communicate in a marketing style way, which is not necessarily the best way to make people confident in what you're doing. Have you seen that issue or approach in your research?
Yes. For example, in the survey, it has shown that people actually have different motivations and interests to communicate, and that also the individual interests and motivations of the communication professionals do not always correspond to the motivations and interests of their organizations. By the way, I'm not sure whether the university professors want them to communicate in that way, but I do agree that the institution, as the thing it has become, is prone to this mechanism.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank Cooper. I will go on to the next speaker, which is Ulrike Feld from University of Vienna in Austria. She will talk about the impact of science, communication, and society. So Ulrike, I'm extremely interested in your comments to all this debate. The cyberspace is yours.
Yeah, so let me start by thanking all three presenters and Jens for inviting me to share my thoughts about your really interesting projects. And I was first thinking, so do I prepare a presentation? And then I thought it might be much nicer to do what all these projects actually claim and want to do, namely engage with what is out there. So I decided, no, I'm not going to give you my view on what it is, but I would like to share for each of the projects some of the ideas which I thought were really interesting and maybe also challenging. I would like to start with something quite interesting, which always strikes me, because of course, by doing these European projects, we also create an idea of Europe and European publics. And it's so interesting to look at which countries are very prominently there, and therefore what kind of cultural differences do we actually capture with some of these projects. And I think, as you all have done very careful work in these different contexts, I always personally found it extremely interesting to see the resources, the discursive resources people have when they are embedded in a particular national context. So there is a tradition of thinking about science and how science works. There are a tradition of kind of imagining what science communication should do, but it's also an imagination. And I cannot exactly, I think it was Arco, but I'm not entirely sure, or Frank. So this idea about about that every country has an idea about its publics and how educated and informed they are. And I was smiling when I was listening to you, because this idea that the present people are much better than those out there is a continuous encounter I made in my research, that people think about themselves because they participate in these projects differently than these other publics out there that are much less, let's say, interested, educated, etc. So we might want to think about, sorry, and I've spent quite some time doing that, what our selectivity kind of creates. And I think that was really interesting when I was listening to you. So to think maybe about what the choice of countries, but also the fact that people come in, there is some form of self-selection, etc. going on. So it's quite interesting to think about publics, thinking about publics and what the societal problem is. So that is something that I found really interesting. The second thing is we tend, and I include in the we myself, we tend to take the big cases like climate change or vaccines or whatever, because we tend to think this is what people really should know at least about, because that's the big problem. But what I find interesting is, and I was wondering what you, from your experiences, have kind of collected, is what is made visible and invisible when you focus on these kind of big topics. And I'm also interested in knowing, so what is made visible about the practices of science and how knowledge is generated and how tentative scientific knowledge is always. And I would invite you, there is a very nice little clip on the World Health Organization on COVID-19, which I found really interesting, where it says, keep your mind open because it will change all the time. And if you're not ready to say, yeah, we change, and this knowledge about the disease changes and the virus changes, then this goes wrong. And I find that an interesting way to think about, so how much do we teach people that science is on the move? And how much do we love to have these closed stories that are more robust, let me call it like that. And I've been observing, and Jens, I think, said that about the institution, the temporality is really an interesting topic that runs for me across all topics. So first of all, how much time can anybody invest in engaging? And do we think this invested time is worthwhile? And I think institutions want to get at important multipliers more than they want to get at people writ large. And I'm very often saying it's fascinating that universities always try to communicate to the outside, but they lack to communicate to the inside. So to their students, etc. And it's fascinating. I'm teaching across many different fields as an STS professor. It is fascinating to see when you move from one field to the next, what is totally unknown for highly educated publics, we would say. So it's not only about not being able to know or complexity or what others. So we give students the right to be ignorant about many other things of their academic lives in order to make them into specialists. And I do think this has repercussions on the way we discuss about all actually across all the projects, be it on quality indicators, the question of effectiveness, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm wondering, so how does a university reach into its body of people and make them kind of powerful multipliers into that, and make them understand the complexities and the fluidity also that science actually changes, that what we know today might be something quite different in 2 years down the road. And this is not a problem, but that's how science is. And I think this doesn't come really across the way we generally communicate. And so this temporality in science and in communicating science is for me a really interesting question. So that I think maybe you will have to say, you surely have to say something about it. Then I, from my own research, I was wondering, and Anna in particular pointed to that, do people actually know where they take their informations from and how that is reliable? And I give you a funny little side story from my research. So way back, we did a study on how doctor-patient relationships change if people do research before or after they visited the doctor. And so we did some experiments where we gave people a vignette telling them that they have one of these kind of chronic diseases. And we asked them to search for relevant information in the first go. So where would they go? And when you interview them, they have a very clear vision of what is reliable information, how they would collect, etc. And when you show them how they actually collect it, they realize that they would say explicitly, never go to an industry page. And they spent half an hour on the industry page because they did not recognize that it was an industry space. So this kind of disjunction of self-perception and knowing where I assemble my information from is actually something that is challenging, I think. Because, I mean, honestly, sometimes I do not know it. When somebody asks me what my vision on something is, and then would I know where I've taken all these puzzle pieces from? Oh, there I read an article, and there I read my newspaper, etc. Okay, so this I think is maybe also something we could kind of reflect on. And then I'm wondering, at least Anna, but the others more implicitly did so. You were speaking about problem solution packages in a way. So science communication should not be only about problem communication, but also give some, let be advice. I'm not even wanting to use that word, some solution-y thing where people could hang on and say, yes, that's what I could do. Now, the question is, can science communication people deliver on that end? And I'm not so sure. So where would we agree which actions would be decent in a society? And do I delegate that to science communicators, or do we need other forms of? And there I like very much this notion of thinking spaces, or you called it rethinking spaces, I think. I find it really interesting to think about not only how do we describe the science, but also what would be the kind of ways we would kind of point to where this is important. And I was once asked in a TV interview whether I think we should tell people that they should take little actions in climate change, because actually climate change cannot be solved solely by individuals, I don't know, taking 10% less their car, or maybe not flying once a year or whatever. And I said, yeah, I do think this is important. And why? Because that makes them at least sensibilizes them to the problem. It's not the solution. So the question is really, for me, this problem-solution relationship that we sometimes get into science communication, and I'm not so sure how we could deal with that. And then Frank's explicit kind of thinking about this digital revolution, I find that really interesting. But I was just wondering, public disagreement, has been present since the 70s, when we started on TV to have these debates on major controversies, where different experts were kind of bringing up different solutions. So the battle of expertise is with us actually since the 70s, I would say, came with TV and the performance, etc. So I'm wondering, is the difference that scientists can do that themselves? And what does that mean if it's because that was mediated always by journalists. What does it mean if scientists just do that themselves on Twitter, for example? What is the quality what is the quality of this unmediated kind of battling over issues? And I think you very nicely pointed in these rethinker spaces. I would want, and you spoke about repertoires, and I would very much like to think, if you think that there are something like national or group specific or repertoires that people can piggyback on to make an argument, which I find interesting. For example, I go into a debate on nanotechnology, and people come up with Austrians' experience in the nuclear. And you think, what does the one have to do with the other? But that's the only imagination they had about rejecting a technology. And that discussion opened up their possibility to think about rejection. So they piggyback on this discourse to make the point in a totally disjunct discourse, which has really nothing to do the one with the other. So, yeah. And so I was wondering if I could invite you to think about, what does the digital fundamentally change as relationships, etc. So I get a red sign that means that I should stop here. And so I would love to have some engagement on these issues. Thank you so much for your presentations and for sharing your ideas about how to tackle the complex problem of science communication.
Thank you very much, Ulrike Felt, and I think it was really, really interesting to hear your comments. And I'm also quite curious about the different aspects of science communication. Who is communicating, and should the researchers communicate directly? There's actually a question from the audience here, which is popping up on my screen, and it says, if citizens trust scientists more than journalists, would they then prefer to interact more directly with the scientist? Was that a topic for the workshop? And I don't know if you or any have a good answer to that. So I will answer, and I would say that that in my experience, the very best communicators are scientists, but very few researchers are really good at communication. But if they are, and we're talking like 1 or 2%, if they are much better than any journalist because they know their topic so much better. But there's also a danger with researchers communicating, and that is, and we have seen that several times, that some of the best communicators, they also have a tendency to communicate things which are not entirely true. They are overselling their research project, they are overselling their results, and they are so good at communicating that nobody stops them, and that can really be a problem because we run into that people believe something which is not entirely true. So so there has to be some kind of checks and balances even on good communicators, so we avoid that it's being oversold. And of course, if science and results of science is being oversold, it will lose a lot of credibility in the end when people find out how it really is. So good communicators, brilliant communicators, yes, but they still have to be controlled and ask critical questions. I don't know if any has any comments to that. That was my personal point of view.
Jens, I could also respond to that question. Perhaps also reflecting one of Ulrike's comments on what has the digital really changed. Because the question now is framed quite categorical. So citizens trust science more than journalists. Actually, I think one of the things that the digital has done is made things much more personal. So what you see on social media is that people, they tend to follow certain, well, scientists or certain journalists that they trust. And these function as a kind of curator for them. Also, now in the COVID-19 pandemic, you see that some, well, at least I'm talking now based on my observations of Dutch Twitter, for example. You see some people, some individuals really stand out, and people start following them because they trust in what they have to say. And some of those are journalists, and others are scientists. Now, this idea of science journalists as curators has, I think, already been signaled by people like Matthew Nisbet and Declan Fay a couple of years ago. And I think it is an important way forward also to think about science journalism. What is the role of science journalism in a world that's overloaded with information? I think this curator role is actually quite important.
Yeah, no, I must say I totally agree with that. I think we had a terrible situation during the lockdown in the COVID crisis where all the media closed, and especially the public service media in many countries, that they sent their science journalists home, and then there was only some very journalists who covered all topics for everybody. And I think that's a big mistake, because in that way they cut off the trusted line to people who know what they're talking about. So I think that's dangerous to do. I think Anna Delicado also had a comment here. Anna?
Yes, because I'm guessing that this question was about our consultations, because I repeated, I don't know how many times, that citizens seem to trust scientists more than journalists. To my great chagrin or disappointment, I don't think our participants want to interact more directly with anyone. They seem to prefer information being given to them through TV, but they prefer that scientists give that information rather than journalists. That's kind of rapport that they want to have with science communication. Also, many mentioned that in view of fake news and misinformation, that information should be certified by government bodies, which is a highly centralized thing to do. I'm quite disappointed because I was expecting people to want more direct, more engaging, more dialogue than dissemination. But in fact, that's not what happened in our workshops, in our consultations. People want traditional science communication. They want to be taught. They want to be shown the science. It's disappointing because I've a long time criticizing science communication. And I seem to remember that science communicator I know that is very prominent in my country used to say that dialogue is gourmet science communication. And she was not that interested in that. She wanted to reach the masses. And that goes against everything I've thought about the issue, but I was disappointed because people don't want to get involved in scientific topics. They don't want to engage in participatory activities, in giving their opinion, maybe because they haven't seen it done before. That's probably the problem, that there's not a lot of participatory and engaging and dialogical initiatives. And so they want what they know, which is more science on TV, more science in newspapers, more science from governmental bodies and from universities. And I was thinking about what Uli said about the big cases, climate change, vaccines. I think we all chose to deal with particular topics because I think what is done in surveys, like, what do you think about science, does not work. Science in itself, it's something so big, so diverse, so multifarious that it's quite impossible to engage in a discussion about science. And that's why we chose those topics. But for instance, in our case, GMOs is a non-topic. It hasn't been talked about in a very long time. People had no idea what GMOs were. We had a lot of difficulty in discussing because there's no public discussion in these countries about GMOs. So people didn't have an opinion because they didn't know what it was. So this was not just big topics like climate change and vaccines, which are in fashion, let us say, but even more. If we had a discussion about nanotechnology, it would be impossible. Nobody knows what it is. So it's difficult to have an opinion.
Can I jump here in? Anna,
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Sorry. Anna, I agree with you with your kind of analysis. However, for me, the point is, and it's true. So people, at least they know what climate change is. But for example, if you would move to Austria, maybe they would not understand GMO, but they would understand if you call it genetically modified food. Okay, so the question is also how we frame the problem and what is touched on them by it. So if I speak about food, then this becomes a very different thing. So I think this is an interesting observation that you say, and that's what I meant in the beginning when I said, is there a repertoire of, can have people resources in a cultural context to speak about things? And we, for example, have developed these card-based discussion methods because we had a project on nanotechnology and there was no public debate, or at least not a sustained one where I would think, oh, people know it. So we had to develop resources, and it was really kind of interesting. We had to collect for them the diversity of little bits and pieces and give them the chance to position them towards these kinds of things. And then suddenly they could say something. So this is also the question, like, how do we want to engage with them beyond what they anyway know? And then the interesting thing for me was that they do not know anything about how science works. They know about results and but they have no idea how knowledge is generated, how it is on the move, or whatever. Now you can ask them if they want to know about it, and they might not be very thrilled about it. But then we could think about ways, when we speak about engagement, we could think about ways to actually bring that in and make them better understand the everyday practices of science and the difficulties we have, because that's part of the problem we have, that there is a quite naive vision of straightforward, it's red or blue, it's black or white, and knowledge is published, and and stable and things like that. And that's why I like this little video on COVID-19 by the World Health Organization, because I've never seen a video that says, guys, actually, we know very little and this knowledge is totally on the move. And it ends with an open brain in a way of a citizen or whatever that person is, that has different kinds of influences flowing in. And I was kind of thinking, how interesting, because normally these videos are packaged and you tell people what COVID-19 is, how they should behave, etc. So this kind of normative idea that there is some we that knows, and the we can be a group of experts or whatever, an institution, etc. And there are people who do not know. But actually, these people know a lot about their everyday practices, and we should have listened, in particular in COVID-19, a bit more to what we know about people's behavior and practices and things like that in order to handle the situation. It's not just about knowing how the virus works and whether or not you go to the ICU, or you know what I mean. So I think it's also the kind of whole pedagogy that is in science, built into science communication sometimes, which I find interesting to observe. So what is the pedagogy in that sense that is built into it?
Thank you very much, Ulrike. I just want to remind the audience that they can still ask questions, and we have almost 15 minutes left of this session. So please write your questions and send them via the chat channel. I'll give the floor to Frank Cooper.
Yes, thank you, Jens. There are so many things I would like to respond to now after the interesting contributions of Anna and Uli. I really liked from what you were saying about what is made visible and invisible. This is not my first European project, and I recognize that as researchers, you are also part of this dynamic of European projects, the dynamic of the research innovation as a competitive funding mechanism, where, well, this, the outreach, communication, dialogue also has a place. And actually, I think that this is also why we chose to work with these sense-making practices, so to reverse the direction in the relationship between science and public. So instead of telling people what they should know about science, first, find out how people make sense of their world, what needs they have, and then see how scientific information could contribute to that. I think that also a part of that is that a lot of science communication is focused on facts and theory, conveying facts and theories. Whereas actually, if you look at controversies or disagreements, the disagreements are often at a level of values and visions. So what you see often is that people are fighting each other with their own alternative facts, whereas actually the conversation about the underlying values and the question, what world do we want to live in, is not addressed. I mean, these ideas are, and I think that's also really interesting, maybe contrasting with what Anna has found in her citizen consultations, because you just said people actually want to be informed about state of affairs. I think an interesting observation there is also, and I'm not saying that to stick to my own truth, but also citizens are in the same system that we are trying to change. So this is also what they expect from science or from science communication, because that's what they know about it, or that's how they've been taught about the relationship between science and society. So I think if you want to transform the system of science communication, you should go beyond asking either scientists or their publics what to do, because we are all part of this system. So then that's what we are trying to do in these rethinker spaces, to have these transformative conversations about what is the future that we envision and how can we get there.
Yeah, but Frank, we also have a problem of different perception of science communication. I mean, the marketing approach is not necessarily the best way to try to convince people that vaccines are good, or whatever we need to tell people in order to make them feel confident at what's going on. You must agree on that.
Yeah. Maybe that's I'll just think out loud here. Maybe that's another thing that is more difficult to realize in this digital age, is actually the marketing approach, because it's if you can also see the backstage, so the back end of the conversation, this marketing approach, which is hiding, indeed, like Ulrike has also pointed out, hiding a lot of aspects of the practice of science. If they will become visible through other ways, for example through social media, then I think you will always fall into this pitfall, and people think, okay, now I don't trust you anymore because I've seen that you made a mistake. That is also why I think, and why I agree with Ulrike that this WHO clip is so interesting. In the Netherlands, we've seen that the Dutch Center for Disease Control at first did try to embrace uncertainty in their COVID-19 communication, but also stick with the traditional approach of trust us because we are the expert institution on this. And then every time they had to adjust their view or their estimation of things in the light of new findings or new circumstances, it felt like they lost. It felt like they failed. Whereas actually, this is just a part of how science works, and how actually all attempts to acquire knowledge about the world work. So I think it's being open, being honest about how science works is actually really important.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'll give the floor to Arco, who had some comments too.
Just a quick comment picking up where Frank left. So I very much agree that showing how science works is a very important part of science communication, and this is actually what we also learn from our stakeholders, that they consider this transparency of the scientific process an valuable aspect, with the expectation that this can also kind of solve some of these problems that we associate with science communication, with just providing facts or just providing solutions. So once people maybe pick up from this science communication, which also highlights not just the results, but how the researchers got to these results, what were the discussions there, some kind of controversies. Once this process is highlighted and people learn about this kind of how science operates, it kind of gives them the tools to evaluate future similar situations better. And this might also kind of be a way to respond to what Ulrike was bringing out earlier, that whether kind of providing these solutions to people, give me specific actions, what can I do to solve climate change, whether this is the way to approach it. In another project, we've been thinking a lot about environmental education, and we also come to the point that we tend to teach facts, the basic facts. We tend to provide people those solutions, like you should recycle, you should not use plastic bags, but kind of this linking process there of why these kind of actions help what kind of actions are more helpful or less helpful based on scientific evaluations, this kind of thing is missing. So the expectation of this transparent scientific process communication is that once people can start to understand the processes, the interrelations, they're also better at evaluating, for example, those specific solutions, or being able to develop those solutions for the situations that they have in front of themselves. To think about, in my country, in my city, in my neighborhood, what's the most effective way for me to tackle climate change? And then not to stick to some pseudo solution, but really find the most effective way.
That's very much very interesting, Akko. I can see here I get some more questions and actually several questions in one. And I would like to ask the whole panel this question, I think, which is really interesting. You said communicators do not know their audiences. How to change the mind cultures of the communicators? Education, dissemination, discussion. I think that's an important issue. How do we change the mind of those who are communicating science so they understand their audiences? Is there anybody who has a good? Yeah, that's Frank Cooper.
Yeah, I think this was a finding from our survey, at least. And actually, it's part of our project, but I think it's also part of the other projects on stage here. Is actually also these projects all have a training component where we are going to develop guidelines, resources for education and training. That actually focus on a few of these things. So focus on different audiences, different ways of connecting to audiences, reversing the order of the relationship. Relate first before you communicate. I think for us, for our project, the Rethinker spaces are also at least that's how we would like to see it, the seed of a transformative network. So this is also the way that we are not only having discussions with these professionals in the Rethinker space, but we are also planning to do things together. So to experiment with new forms of science communication together. And finally, I think it's also important that in higher education institutions, science communication is a class or course you can follow.
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
Well, the whole point of this research that we are doing is to convey our results to science communicators, to practitioners. So that is how we're trying to solve this issue. And finally, will there be a synthesis? Yes, the three projects are working together to do things jointly and to combine our results in order to make better information and better recommendations for science communication.
There's also a question about the three reports. Will you make a synthesis together, or will you make reports separately in the end?
I hope that we're going to do things together and compare the results of the projects. We are in discussions about that. We have a session in Brussels in November that all of us will participate. So the idea, yes, is to combine and to discuss and to join these results.
And we are doing a special issue in the Journal of Science Communication. The call is open now for anyone that would like to participate. So so there are different ways that we are working together and trying to reach the people around us and our communities.
Thank you very much. We are running on the last minute. I will thank all the speakers. You did a fantastic job. It was a really interesting session. And I would like to say to those who watch this, that if you want to watch more discussion about science communication and rethinking communication, I can recommend our session in the afternoon, 4:15, where we will have speakers from Brazil, Spain, and Sweden, who will discuss rethinking science communication with experience from COVID-19. I thank you, all of you, and I think we have about 10 seconds left, so that's not much. Thank you. That was a really fantastic session. Thank you all.